Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on the second night of our fall celebration for our event with Robert P. Jones and Edward Ball for White Too Long and Life of a Klansman. We are joined tonight as well by Kealey Bultena from Wisconsin Public Radio, who will be our moderator. Just here at the top, as always, I'd like to say thank you to Madison Public Library and Madison Public Library Foundation for putting on this event, for really believing in free cultural events for Madison, for Wisconsin broadly, and for the nation now that we're broadcasting virtually. So we have people from all over the place, many different, I think in the chat it said Portland already and Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So definitely have a wide swath of people here with us tonight to discuss these two very, very important books. I also want to take a moment to just thank our sponsors who do make these events possible. But really, it's about Edward and Robert and the books that they wrote making our conversation tonight possible. So I will turn over everything to our two authors and our moderator, and I will see you all at the end. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Connor. We really appreciate it as we get into a conversation that might be difficult at some times because we are talking about some very serious subjects here. So thank you so much, Robert and Edward, for having this conversation with us and for telling us about your books. Let's start first with Robert. We're 21 pages into your book when you call Christian teaching racist. Some people might think, yep, absolutely. And there are other people who are going to read your book and maybe get a little bit defensive about that. Why do you use the word racist to describe Christianity?
Yeah, well, the word racist, I mean, and right there in the title of the book is the word white supremacy, right? Another word that I think many people recoil, from. And I think there is a kind of defensive reaction, I think, particularly from white Christians that might say, wait a minute, that's not me, that has nothing to do with me. And when they think of that, they think of, people in white robes and sheets and burning crosses and then distance themselves from that. But, I think one of the things that I try to kind of write about in the book as honestly as I can is how close to us today assumptions that we think weren't there really were. And this basic assumption that whites were a superior race to non-white people in the world and in the country was an uncontroversial claim through most of the country's history and through most of Christianity's history. And undergirding that claim in the country was Christianity as the dominant religious and moral force in the country and in the dominant expression of religion. So, the strongest way to legitimize a worldview is to connect it to a divine ordering of the universe. And that's exactly the role that Christianity played through most of American history, was to kind of take what was really an uncontroversial view among most whites, that whites were a superior race, and to wrap that in kind of a Christian theological cloak and connect it really to the way that God created the world.
Yeah, the way that God created the world. I mean, you say Christian teachings include the idea that white people are by nature different, by nature above people of color. How did people of Christian faith reconcile that? How do people do it now?
Yeah, well, it's remarkable how recently this was just explicit. I mean, I think to our modern ear today, for many people, it sounds very odd to even say that. But, in my home state of Mississippi, so I grew up as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi, for the most part. And then my family is 6 generations back from Middle Georgia in and around Macon, Georgia. But, even as late as 1960, for example, Ross Barnett was running for governor of Mississippi, and he would on the stump give a Christian defense of segregation. And he would literally say, as a regular part of his stump speech, God was the original segregationist. All right, that was a line right out of his stump speech. And when he was elected governor, the tallest steeple church in the state, First Baptist Church of Jackson, Mississippi, held a special consecration service for him after he had run on this explicitly racist segregationist platform, and blessed him and gave him a big fancy pulpit Bible, and was kind of a sanctification service for this racist segregationist governor. and put a Christian blessing on him as he went into office. So it wasn't that far back there that it's there today. And what I show in the book is that it's not just historical, but even we can talk about it a little bit more, but I'll just tee it up right now. But even in public opinion data today, you can look at the views of white Christians, and they look significantly different. That is, they hold more racist attitudes than whites who are not Christian. It's a real dividing line in the culture today. So you can still see this legacy kind of creeping its way forward into the present. It's not just way back there.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's talk more about that, because Edward, too, one of the points that you make in your book is very clearly that this is not something of the past. There are elements of it that we've let go of, but white supremacy and these ideas are very much alive today.
Well, I think they are. I think that white supremacy has been a founding thesis of our national life. I describe it as an underground river that runs through the course of American history. It waters the roots of our institutions. White supremacy feeds the aquifers of our culture, and it remains underground, but occasionally it erupts in geysers of violence, in massacres, in widespread assaults on people of color. And then it returns, the geysers subside, and it returns to the underground. So I agree with Robert's observation that, white supremacy is a long-standing feature of the institutions, not only of the church, but of our cultural life. And what I do in this book, Life of a Klansman, is try to tell an origin story for white supremacy, how it inhabits, how it comes to inhabit the minds and mentality and routines of a single family, in this case in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and how it becomes part of the atmospheric white supremacist beliefs and habits, become part of the atmosphere that's breathed in and out by a small group of people who become involved with the Ku Klux Klan in Louisiana. So that's the smaller version of the bigger story that Robert is telling.
Yeah, your book centers around this direct ancestor of yours who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. You write "my predecessor" and you write "our Klansman." Why do you go so far as to choose those first person possessives? You take ownership.
Well, yes, I think it's important to try to take ownership of, one's familial inheritance, good and bad. And I think habitually, most people who do family history prefer to take ownership of things in their ancestral past that flatter them living in the present. For example, to study the lives of people who were rich or people who were prominent in their communities. But if you think about it, quite a lot of us have ancestors who were involved in criminal activity, and in this case, in Klan activity. I have an ancestor, his name was Constant Lecorne in Louisiana, in New Orleans, my grandmother's grandfather in New Orleans, who was a participant in the first generation of the Ku Klux during the years after the Civil War. And everybody in our family knows this, has known it for generations, but it's never been a subject of conspicuous discussion. But I wanted to look at it more carefully and try to tell the story of this one man as a way of understanding the mechanisms of white supremacy in a family context.
Edward, early in your book, you have this incredible description of a dinner table And as you're revealing it's cherry wood with the scalloped pedestal and the feet like claws, you write this, in a manner of speaking, we ate with our Klansmen 1,000 times. That really struck me. Tell us more about what you mean there.
Well, it has to do with taking ownership, as you characterized it a moment ago. This Klansman was a carpenter, and he made his living with wood. And among his possessions, apparently, was a dinner set that came down to the hands of my mother, and was the dinner table at which our family ate 1,000 times. A rather beautiful Victorian era cherry wood dinner set with a sideboard, marble topped sideboard, and drawers and mirrors and what have you. So it's not that far in the past, and people in one's family life who might have been involved in white supremacist activity are not that far distant from any of us. In fact, I estimate that 1/2 of white Americans today have at least one ancestor who participated in some way in one of the episodes of the Ku Klux Klan, which came and went over the generations. 1/2, approximately 135 million white people. So that means either one person in a room or another person in a room who might happen to be white that you know can claim to have had a Klansman in the family. So it's actually not that unusual.
How do you figure that out, those numbers?
Well, the Klan had 3 surges of activity. The first was during Reconstruction in the 12 years following the Civil War. That was the period with which my ancestor Constant Lecorne, who was a French-speaking Creole in New Orleans, was involved. 50 years later, there was another wave of Klan activity during the 19-teens and 20s. And the Klan became a national organization with approximately 4 to 5 million dues-paying members. And that was the era of the Klan that popularized the sheets and hoods, the white sheets and hoods. Now, if you take in 1925, if you take the number of 4 million Klansmen and you estimate their descendants, the descendants of 4 million Klansmen would number, each Klansman has approximately 35 million grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-grandchildren, 35 individual grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And that amounts to 4 million becomes 135 million descendants. Now, most families don't know today that they might have this kind of ancestral inheritance, but it would be possible to find it out.
Robbie, how important is this idea of learning, of knowing, not just in general, but really specifically about our own families?
You know, I think it's vitally important. I think, and the word that Edwards used is something like being responsible, ownership, and it's really about telling a truer story, right, about who we are, and by virtue of that, how we got to where we are. I mean, I think we look around today, and if you ask, gosh, why all the racial tension? Why all the strife around issues of race and racial justice? Well, there's a fairly simple story for that, but it's one that we don't know very well. I think that particularly for whites and white Christians have kind of suppressed, this history. And I had a very similar, experience kind of looking through my own family's, archival stuff. I have inherited my mother's family Bible from 1815, handed down mother to daughter, actually, and I'm the first son to have it. And it tells the story of Pleasant Moon. He was a British, immigrant first to Virginia, then down to Georgia, And, knowing this story, and if I tell my own family story, um, just real quick, there'd be one way I could tell it is Pleasant Moon was a foot soldier in the Revolutionary War, right? It's a very patriotic way of telling the story. He came and homesteaded in Georgia on a 200-acre farm, staked out a claim, and that's the story that I kind of knew. But there's another way to tell this story that is Pleasant Moon. After serving in the Revolutionary War, won a land lottery to get 200 free acres of land in Georgia. Where did that land come from? It came from the Cherokee Indians, Native Americans, who had been forcibly cleared off that land by the federal government. And then it was carved into nice, neat little squares of 200 acres to give away to white settlers. And even for him, who was a not wealthy, basically we would call him like lower working class, a little bit more than subsistence farmer, the way that his life worked was that he owned 4 enslaved people, right? He enslaved 4 people to even make his little subsistence farm work. And when I looked at the wills and the estate settlement, all of his worldly possessions when he died in 1818 amounted to about $50,000 in today's money. So not a lot. I mean, this was not a wealthy person, but about 70% of those assets were tied up in 4 enslaved people, right? That's how much invested in enslaving other human beings. And this is the same family tree that has Baptist ministers. And so all of this is like very much compatible with what it meant to be a good, upstanding Christian. There was like no tension really there in the story. So I think it's important to be able to tell a truer story for the sake of a healthier present.
Where does the tension happen? Where did you figure out that suddenly somebody started asking questions and maybe the Christian ideals of your family didn't quite line up with the idea that we should treat people with dignity and respect regardless of the color of their skin?
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, it was fairly hidden from me growing up in Mississippi. Like I grew up and I grew up in the 1970s as an elementary school kid. I remember the first Black kids showing up in my school, but that's 20 years after Brown v. Board of Education, right? And so it meant that Mississippi was able to drag its feet that long. But my church, and I was there all the time. I mean, I was that kid who was there at church like literally 5 times a week all the way through my adolescence. Not once talked to us about why are all the Black kids showing up at school? What does this mean? What is the history? How do we understand what's happening here? There was not any conversation about that, but there was kind of these little cracks, right, that would show up. An emergency deacons meeting that happened when one Black kid showed up and sang in the choir one Sunday morning, right? This kind of like, wait a minute, like, what's that about? Like, why are we having an emergency deacons meeting over one Black kid, showing up? And then finally, in seminary, so I have a degree from a Southern Baptist seminary, and it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I first heard the origin story of my own denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, and that is that it was formed in 1845 in order to allow the compatibility between enslaving other human beings and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Like that was the origin story of my own denomination, which no one had told me in all those years of church going. And again, if we're going to have an accurate understanding of where we are and where these tensions come from, we can't do that without owning and taking responsibility for, again, this not so distant past.
Yeah, I want to talk to you both about this because each of you tells stories of family members in retelling these family stories, where family members reacted with satisfaction, or you picked up on this sense of prestige or honor in these injustices, in these inequalities. And I just, Robbie, we'll start with you, but how do you process that when you know it's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you one story that I talk about in the book was this kind of remarkable conversation I had with my great uncle, who told me the story of my great grandfather who was killed in a mining accident just outside of Macon, Georgia. And, he tells me the story, which I'd known, that was kind of part of the family lore, but he said, well, there's another chapter to this that you probably don't know. And I said, well, okay, well, what is it? And, he told me this just awful story about how the very next week, it turns out that his fellow coworkers blamed an African-American for his accidental death. And that African-American man was quote unquote, mysteriously crushed by a cart, by a heavy mining cart the next week. So there was a retaliatory racial killing. After my great grandfather, dies as part of an accident, and there was this sense of that what I described in the book is a sense of like satisfaction, right? That the racial scales had been somehow cosmically balanced by this retaliatory act, and even this sense that as a white person and part of a kind of dominant white Christian culture, you can expect that kind of protection and that kind of privilege, right, from your place in the world.
Edward, how do you square that when you value the people you're talking to and listening to, and what they're telling you, they're taking some pride in something that's really unethical, that's wrong?
Well, to talk specifically about the Ku Klux Klan again, during Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan arises in the Deep South as a way of trying to restore white supremacy that has been challenged by new policies emanating from the federal government. And this is the militia movement that my ancestor Constant Lecorne joins. He joins first a group called the Knights of the White Camellia, then another group called the White League. And these are groups that are involved in street fighting, in night riding. They go out carousing and marauding in black villages. And I'll get to the inherited shame or glory that's attached to these events in a moment. But there was a culminating event in 1874 in New Orleans called the Battle of Canal Street, in which the White League, in which my ancestor fought, succeeds in overthrowing the Reconstruction government, which is the Union occupation government that's charged with trying to assist newly emancipated African Americans to establish lives and economic livelihood and enter politics and become full citizens. Well, the White League manages to overthrow this Reconstruction effort. And a couple of years later, the federal government withdraws the Union Army that is occupying the Deep South, and Reconstruction comes to an end, and white supremacy and Jim Crow are established with an iron fist. Now, this event is celebrated by white Louisianians for the next 100 years. It's commemorated almost annually in public parades. It's remembered with as a kind of hallmark, glorious hallmark in the history of the South, because white supremacy is reestablished. And my own family, of course, is part of this. And it's only about the late 1960s, during the period of reconsideration that's launched by the civil rights movement, that the Ku Klux is divested of its glory. So when I come of age, which is in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the memory of the Klansman is in a transitional state, and my ancestors' life and actions are, conveyed with a certain amount of shame and taboo around them. So, as a generational matter, pride and high status are replaced by shame and ambivalence in recent decades. So that's a long answer to your question, but it's a history of emotion that runs through a family, as well as a story of memory.
Well, and it's one that changes not just with generations, but even within people. Sometimes you can move from recognizing that something was, full of valor, to realizing that maybe it wasn't as brave or as impressive as you thought. What about this issue of whiteness, Edward? What does that mean to you, and what role do you see it playing right now?
Right now, well, uh, this is a very interesting time, isn't it? I think that something impressive and important has begun to happen this year. And it appears that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and in the echo of the marches of tens of millions of people, perhaps a third of them white people in the streets to protest the culture of violence in the policing of African Americans. It appears that large numbers of white people, perhaps for the first time, are recognizing their own white identity, their own white racial identity and its significance. Habitually, and for generations, we, as white people, easily recognize Blackness and Black people as an entity, as a group, and Asianness and Asian people as a racial group, but have traditionally been unable to see ourselves as white people as part of a racial group whose identity has effects and has power and has influence not only in political and economic life, but in our own psychological makeup. So I think that whiteness is something that's, if you like, coming into its own in I speak ironically, of course, in an interesting way in recent times.
Yeah, we see whiteness as the default, and everything else is other. Robbie, I saw you nodding your head while Edward was talking. What's your take about grappling with this idea of whiteness?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's something quite extraordinary happening this year. I mean, I think 20 years from now, we will be talking about 2020. I think this is a very significant moment. And I could say, so, I turned in the book manuscript almost exactly a year ago. And I have to say that the landscape in many ways has been transformed. Just from the last 12 months, from the time I turned out the manuscript to the time the book actually came out, this summer. Just one example, I spent some time in Richmond, and when I was there, I would kind of walk, up and down Monument Avenue and past these 5 massive monuments to Confederate leaders that were deliberately laid out in these kind of, very linear park-like traffic circles for, more than a mile down out of the west side of Richmond. And today, 4 of the 5 statues at the center of those monuments have been torn down and removed. And the 5th one to Robert E. Lee is scheduled for removal. It's not a matter really of if, but when. I think for that monument, the pedestals are all spray painted, with Black Lives Matter slogans. That's something quite extraordinary. And just one, I think, story I'll tell related to that is First Baptist Church of Richmond. Was a church that actually moved itself from downtown in the 1920s during that height of the Ku Klux Klan's reemergence and white supremacy's kind of reemergence in a new way to be closer to the Confederate monuments after they were built. They actually relocated to be on the traffic circle by the Andrew Jackson Memorial. And at the removal of that statue this summer, the lay people in the church rang the bell. The big bronze church bell to celebrate the removal of this monument really to white supremacy and the Confederacy. And it turns out, I did a little digging, that is the same bell that this church had offered up during the Confederate War, during the Civil War, to be melted down to create Confederate cannons. Now the Confederate Army said they didn't need it, so they kept their bell. But if you think about an arc, right? This is a church, again, that's part of the Southern Baptist Convention, formed to kind of defend slavery, that has gone from offering up its bell to mount down cannon to kill people, to defend the right to enslave other human beings in the name of Christianity, to being a place ringing that same bell to celebrate this shift in our culture.
You point out that church and culture go hand in hand, Robbie. I talked with a friend of mine who's a pastor, and she absolutely understood. I mean, she said white ministers were preaching to support American culture, and the culture was looking for a way to justify enslaving other human beings, and churches provided that. How did Christianity become, as you put it, this connective tissue?
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that, the white citizens councils, that dotted much of the South and were in many ways the enforcers and informants, to the police, members of the highway patrol themselves, people who were in other realms were also Sunday school teachers and deacons. Like I talked about Ross Barnett, he was the head of the men's Sunday school program at First Baptist Church in Jackson. So they were forming these roles, and so you would have pastors who would have, in Jackson at First Baptist, for example, you had the Hedermans who controlled the Clarion Ledger newspaper, the Jackson Daily News, which Columbia School of Journalism at the time called the most racist newspapers in the country. And they were also big funders of First Baptist Church, where Ross Barnett went. So you had this kind of confluence and connective tissue, I think, that happened there. And it goes like all the way back. The other thing I'd say about the KKK that's worth remembering too is that it saw itself as having a white Protestant Christian identity, right? It wasn't just a secular organization. I mean, it really was about a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian America that they were really defending against Jews and Catholics and African Americans and others that they saw not being a part of that WASPy, American identity. And one thing for the White League, I read a little bit about the White League in my book as well, and just noting, right, that their kind of founding document talks about the need to fight for, quote, the maintenance of our hereditary civilization and Christianity, menaced by a stupid Africanization. Like that's the literal words, from the document, right? So kind of linking up, and it really was baptized, really in Christian language, in ways that again were fairly uncontroversial for that worldview.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, Edward, the Bible shows up in your book too. You pull from scripture and you write about whether people who are generations removed from someone who stood for this inequality, whether they owned enslaved people or whether they were members of one of these white supremacy groups, you write about whether people later in the generations are responsible, and you pull from the Bible. Why do you do that?
Well, I can't remember whether it's Deuteronomy or perhaps, Robert, you can help me here. The sins of the fathers are visited on the sons to the third and fourth generation. I believe that's from Deuteronomy. And to corroborate some of what Robert has been saying, the ministers in the Presbyterian Church and in the Episcopal Church in New Orleans and throughout the Deep South, in addition to, of course, Baptist ministers, were preaching throughout the 19th century to maintain the system of enslavement, and preaching for decades and decades after to maintain Jim Crow segregation. But my use of the Bible is to call attention to what has become a commonplace in our sort of public discourse, which is what relationship do we have in the living generation with the crimes of our ancestors? And it's a difficult and thorny question. And my 25-cent answer is that we are not responsible for the crimes perpetrated by our predecessors, but we are accountable for them. We must try to reckon with them and come to terms with them and speak of them honestly and directly and tell their stories. So it may be that the irony of history does come back and bite us on the hand. It may be that the sins of the fathers are visited on the sons. But it's a personal subject of contemplation for any sensitive person.
Well, Marge is listening, watching, and has this question. Can you talk about how you each see the reparations movement, the potential for success, and perhaps any role for Christians in reparations? Robbie, you want to take that first?
Sure. Yeah. It's notable that, again, it's the current moment where these questions are, I think, being taken seriously. The Episcopal Church, for example, I'll give you a couple examples. Virginia Theological Seminary, a couple of years ago, set aside $1.7 million specifically as a reparations fund when they did a study of their own history and looking at everything from where did the land come from to who built the original buildings. It was all, and kind of entangled with enslaved people and on the backs of enslaved laborers, and trying to reckon with what does that mean for us. And I think this accounting, and I think and I've talked about this, is really the need to, if we tell a truer story about ourselves, I think it leads us, again, I love the phrase, if we're sensitive people, I think it leads us to a place of responsibility and repair, right? So what responsibility do we have to repair this damage that's been done over so many generations? And so I think that we're seeing that the Maryland Episcopal Diocese, the Texas Episcopal Diocese, I think New York as well, all are having conversations, then setting aside multi-million-dollar funds that will go to to benefit either African-American clergy or direct descendants of people who they were the beneficiaries of. So I think there's luckily, I think for the first time, and I think it's notable, right, that here we are in 2020, right? And it's just been in the last few years that these conversations have seriously come into play. I think it again tells us that there's a kind of turning of the wheel here where, maybe even you can think about this after so many kind of eruptions and kind of fits and starts, that we are finally getting to kind of a more of a place of maturity and a place where we can actually look back and have some conversations about this. But I do think we have to talk about, justice and repair, and not just, I make the distinction between justice and the repair on the one hand and reconciliation on the other, that we're not going to get to reconciliation without the work of justice and repair.
Edward, how do you respond to Marge's question?
Well, picking up on the Christian thread, I think that we're talking about the subject of atonement. When one attempts an act of atonement, first there is a request for forgiveness by the perpetrator or her representative, followed by an act of contrition, which may be an act of repair or reparation, or may take some other form. And only when those things are in play, in train, can there be some kind of reconciliation genuinely described. I think it is an extraordinary thing that reparations have become part of the national conversation in the past 3 to 4 years, quite unexpectedly, I think, for those of us who pay attention. About 20 years ago, I published a book called Slaves in the Family. And that book told the story of my father's family in South Carolina, who were major slaveholders for 175 years. And our family in South Carolina enslaved approximately 4,000 people during that time. And I wrote this book, which told the stories of 10 African-American families whom my family had enslaved, as well as the story of my own white family in South Carolina, from slavery down to the present. And as part of this process of trying to reckon with the inheritance of slaveholding, I decided that I wanted to try to make symbolic acts of restitution. And so I organized a reparations program. It was small. I took about $100,000 from the book money that I had earned and began to set up a small foundation and gave grants to descendants of people who had been enslaved by my predecessors. So it was, and after 3 or 4 years, the money was gone. But it was a symbolic act of restitution. And I think that what Robert describes and what we're seeing elsewhere is that there are appearing around this country small, symbolic, and local acts of restitution that inhabit institutions such as universities and churches. And it's a good development. Georgetown University, as you may remember, in 1842, I think, sold its enslaved population out of Virginia, 270 people, sold that group of people down the river, as they say, to Louisiana and Mississippi, to the cotton plantations, to raise money to save the institution of Georgetown. And now, in 5 years now, Georgetown has been reckoning with this inheritance of slave selling and establishing a restitution program that tries to begin the act of repair. So I think these are good developments. I don't know, just to finish, that the momentum is strong enough that it will take up the federal government. Mm-hmm. I'm skeptical that it will, but one has to wait and see.
Yeah, Robbie, you agree with that there's momentum, but not maybe enough?
Yeah, I think there is a momentum, and the one thing I'd say, we actually have been doing some polling on this at PRRI, and when we've asked, and when you ask about whether the federal government, as you say, this is where it gets much more entangled. And the last polling we had on this, only about 30% of the country said that they supported the federal government, getting involved in some kind of direct reparations program.
That's
it's a little bit more than
it
was,
Robert,
more than it was in the
past.
Number.
Yeah,
yeah, but it's about 3 in 10 Americans today that say that they favor the federal government becoming directly involved.
Both of you have told several different stories. Most of it, maybe all of it, rooted in the South, and we really need to talk about the idea that racism, white supremacy, this is not a Southern issue. This is an American issue. This is a human issue. Robbie, how do we begin to think about that? And how do you pitch something when your book has deep Southern roots to people here in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I would say that what you said is exactly right. I mean, this is an American problem, and while my book has a kind of memoir, anchor to it, I do kind of broaden the lens a bit, and it's important to note that this too, that every Protestant denomination of any size split over the issue of slavery in the Civil War, right? So the Methodist split, the Presbyterian split, the Episcopalian split. It's not just sort of Baptists in the Deep South, but they kind of split into northern and southern factions. And it's also to note that there is, plenty of evidence that this is also not just a Protestant issue. That even in Catholic churches in New York, for example, as late as the 1940s, were requiring African Americans to sit in the back, only receive Eucharist after white members, had received the Eucharist, had segregated the Catholic schools so that if you were an African American, you couldn't necessarily go to the parish school that was most close to you. You had to go to St. Mark's. That was the Catholic school that you had to go to. So, and I think the bigger evidence for this is, and when I looked at current public opinion data, and look at a whole range of attitudes, what we see is that this connection between Christianity and holding racist attitudes isn't only strong among white evangelicals, which are a more Southern expression, but you're in Wisconsin, right? One of the larger expressions there are mainline Protestants, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, like those groups. But they score in the book I developed what I call a racism index, and scale score 1 to 10, with 10 holding the most racist attitudes across a range of 15 different questions, 1 holding least. White evangelicals score 8, but white mainline Protestants, that group that's more populous in the Midwest, score 7 out of 10 on that racism index, and white Catholics score 7 as well. So they kind of cluster up there, holding more racist views. And even when I control for region, urban versus rural, those kinds of things, this relationship still holds up. So it's not just driven by Southern culture. It's not just driven by urban or versus rural, but it's actually something about the Christian identity that is actually doing the work and is playing the connective tissue between holding these more racist attitudes. The connection is between being Christian and holding more racist attitudes, because that relationship isn't there among whites who are not Christian.
Edward, what do you think about this being more widespread than some of the stories that you tell that happened in the South?
Well, I have a pet theory that the South taught the rest of the country how to behave with respect to race. Most of the African Americans in the United States have an ancestral root in the Deep South. 90% of African Americans lived in the Deep South until 1900. Once African Americans left the Deep South and began to inhabit the northern cities and the West and the South, the white South had perfected the system of segregation and the psychological life of alienation between whites and blacks. And it was as though we conveyed or educated or tutored the rest of the country how to act with respect to African Americans. It would be a self-deception to say that the great people of Wisconsin or Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota are unaware or colorblind and do not think or make decisions on the basis of race. Quite a lot of us as parents spend a lot of time thinking about where our children are going to go to school. Quite a lot of us as homeowners spend a lot of energy thinking about where we're going to buy a house. And quite a lot of us are working in relationships in our workplace with African Americans, but have no Black friends and see no Black people in our lives until 9 a.m. on Monday morning. So it's a kind of realism that I would like to encourage, which is a sort of self-assessment among white people about where we are psychologically in relationship to African Americans.
Well, yeah, please go ahead, Robbie.
I was just going to add just one little layer onto that, because I think it's such a eloquent kind of laying out of the problem, but to kind of add maybe just a religious layer on the top of this. I think there's a similar, way I talk about this in the book is that, so I talk about my, upbringing in the Southern Baptist Convention, this slaveholding convention built specifically to legitimate clergy, in particular, owning slaves. But it's notable that denomination doesn't stay some fringe denomination once it breaks off. But by the 1950s, in the middle of the 20th century, it becomes the dominant expression of Christianity, bar none. It's the largest Protestant denomination of any kind by the middle of the 1950s and the 1960s. And so in the same way, I think Edward's talking about it kind of diffusing throughout the culture. I think that Southern Baptists really did that within religion. They diffused this way of being religious and this kind of views of white supremacy that then get spread, right, I think, into other areas. And the other just quick layer I'd add too is that when we ask a lot about how do we think about schools, how do we think about where we live, the other question we can ask is well, how do we think about where churches got built, and for whom? And so, like, if every white church, for example, ask an honest question about why is our church where it is, you're very quickly going to get to some issue of race and racial discrimination, real estate redlining, white flight to the suburbs. Those issues are going to come forward very, very quickly.
Right. And I mean, this is Wisconsin. We know redlining, then, where policies limited the options for potential homeowners, specifically people of color. And Edward, you actually write about your white supremacist relatives struggling later in life and living near Black people, and try to piece together what that was like for them, because it was different. Why do you mention that in your book?
Right. Well, the folks that I write about, my ancestors in New Orleans during the 19th century, were plain people. They were manual laborers. No one had a higher education, and they were not landholders. They were people who had experienced what we would describe as a class decline, and part of the magnetism for my ancestors around the white supremacist militia movement was, I think, I'm conjecturing, that it gave the promise of exercising public and conspicuous authority over African Americans in their places of work and life. At the end of the life of my protagonist, Constant Lecorne, this Creole carpenter who my grandmother's grandfather, who was active in the Ku Klux Klan movement, at the end of his life, he's kind of fallen on hard times. He has a wife and 5 children, and he and his wife of New Orleans that is 3/4 African American, and they didn't leave any papers or letters or notes about this experience, but I believe that psychologically it was very destabilizing, and this was after 10 years of militant action against Black people. And at the end of the life of this man's wife, and who becomes a widow, she actually moves into an African-American school and works in a public school. It's an African-American public school. And I suspect that this is the way that history visits irony on all of us. The fight to assert white supremacy comes to grief in this family and its everyday life, and it's a bitter meal for them to consume.
Robbie, I want to go back to a story that you've already told tonight, and that was a Black man being blamed for the death of, was it your great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather, yeah.
Okay. One of the things you write when explaining that was that the mine was very dangerous. And then you write, I can only assume that both he and his family wondered as he left for work each day, whether a misstep with his white coworkers or the wrong encounter on the road might be more perilous than the mine. And I mean, I have to say, I am privileged. I do not feel this weight. Black women, Black men, Black families, they talk about this feeling today in this moment that Black people are not safe when they leave their homes or even in their own homes. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's right. And I think part of wrapping our heads around, wanting to have a country where that's not true, right? Wanting to have a country where Black parents and white parents don't have to have different talks with their children, right? Particularly if they have young Black boys
Yeah.
about running. I mean, I remember reading this piece by Jonathan Capehart at the Washington Post. It was so moving to me. He talked about like his mother taught him never to run in public, never to run with anything in his hand in public, lest somebody think either he stole something or it was a weapon. And that even as an adult living in Washington, D.C., when he went for a jog, he would keep his ID card with him, that his not only his driver's license, but his Washington Post card, because had he been stopped or stopped by police, he could have said, I'm a reporter, I work for the Washington Post. But having that burden of having to think about, a society that's structured to put you at risk in a way that it is not structured to put people who look like me or Edward at risk, right? I mean, I think this is the goal, right? But we have to realize that if we're ever going to make a headway on deconstructing and building that society, we have to realize that we built it, right? I mean, we have to kind of own that that's the society we built. And writing from my point of view, I begin the first sentence of the book has the word I in it. The last sentence of the book has the word us. And I'm writing it both as a social scientist, but also as a white Christian, and saying we have to realize we played a role in baptizing that worldview, right? And we have to play a role in deconstructing if we want a future where we don't have, kids have to grow up with these two very different risk and flourishing scenarios. Like that's not the promise of America. I think we've got an opportunity here to really deconstruct this in a way that we perhaps have not had in front of us, certainly in my lifetime.
I know we're running up against time, but I do want to ask you both, how are you learning to be accountable for white supremacy? I mean, certainly you're writing these books, you're telling these stories, but as people, how are you learning to be accountable for this? Edward.
Well, to be accountable for white supremacy would necessarily be a full-time job, because white racial identity includes a component of unconscious feeling of superiority or advantage towards people of color that is so deeply ingrained and comes from such an early period in one's life, from childhood, that to dismantle it, to deconstruct it, to use Robert's word, would be an act of self-analysis that's done throughout the day and throughout week by week. So it's to ask us as white people to engage in continual self-analysis is a difficult ask, and yet certainly part of what we want to do, what I want to do, what we would hope to improve our shared condition by doing is looking at our everyday acts and their consequences, and trying to find ways to understand how our racial identity radiates and influences all of them constantly, without us even knowing. I mean, I make an effort, possibly more of an effort than some people, but certainly not enough. I think that last point on this, the victories of the civil rights movement 50 years ago, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and the beginnings of affirmative action, and the harvest of policy and custom that has changed in such a way as to allow African Americans and other people of color into institutions of power and places of livelihood. Those victories have been placed there mostly from the top down by acts of policy and legislation coming from government entities. But the renovation of consciousness that is required for the further flowering of liberation among African Americans and white people is going to come from individuals at the psychological level, and it's going to come one person at a time from below in personal interactions, and it's going to emerge and diffuse that way. And it's that's the process that I'm hopeful about.
And Robbie, then how are you learning to be accountable for white supremacy?
Yeah, well, I think learning is the right word. I think it's an ongoing, process. I mean, I described, in the book, my first awarenesses of this were really little tiny things growing up, and then kind of opening up in my early 20s, finding this history of my, denomination. But that was 30 years ago, right? I mean, and even the writing of this book over the last 3 or 4 years has been kind of part of that journey. I think it is a journey, and I think it is so ingrained that it really does have to be a journey, an ongoing thing. It's not going to happen all at once, one grand epiphany, and then we're good. And I think it does have to be in conversation with, other African Americans. I think in the country. I think the thing that, but I do think that one thing that white churches can do is to start providing space for this, because I do think this moment, kind of having this kind of introspection. I mean, churches talk about Christian formation and discipleship, and that is really a part of self-examination and growth, and I think if white churches can incorporate interrogating whiteness, right, as part of that, how that has been kind of built in, and where do we see it, where do we not see it, and if we could just take like little things like the killing of African Americans by police, for example, where we have big gulf between where white Christians are on that question, who see it mostly as isolated incidents, and African Americans who see them as part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. There's like a 30-point gap in the public opinion data on this. But I think as white Christians, when we see something like that and we say, okay, we're here, our African American brothers and sisters are here. If we would just maybe have enough humility, having gotten this issue of race so wrong for so long, and just say, you know what, we're just going to pause. Before we go make any grand pronouncements, if we're here and our African American brothers and sisters are here, we're going to wait long enough and just try, I think is what Edward's saying too, just sit with that dissonance long enough to try to understand it and kind of open up a new vista for ourselves. And I'll kind of close with this thing, I think from, I read a lot of James Baldwin, which I think another kind of reading African-American authors who can help, I think, us white people have different perspectives. But one of the things that I was struck by that I thought had a great lesson for us, and as we white people or white Christians, is this, that he said, the civil rights movement began when a despised and oppressed people began to wake up to what had happened to them. And I think there's actually a parallel for us white Christians in this moment. And that's to say, this is not all a call for altruism, right? To do something for other people, because this entanglement of white supremacy with ourselves and our faith and our psyches has damaged us, right? So I think the real question is like, maybe this new moment can happen when we white people begin to wake up and realize what has happened to us, right? And that if we're really going to hand down a healthier culture, a healthier faith to the next generation, it's going to require us really facing this and bearing witness to the truth.
There is so much more to both of your books. We've only scratched the surface of the ideas and the evidence that you provide the reader. I just really appreciate it. Edward, thanks for talking with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Kealey.
And Robbie, we appreciate your time too.
Oh, thank you. It was lovely to be here.
Well, thank you, Kealey, for all of your incredibly thoughtful and penetrating questions. Edward, Robert, thank you so much. There are so many things to take away. I can't actually wait to go back and watch this replay again soon, and to find some of that space to be reflective. I think that is one of the most important elements of it, is understanding that it's never over and that we need to keep reevaluating, keep learning. Thank you for helping us do those things tonight. I want to say thank you to everyone who was here. And we have one more event this evening at 8:30. We're hosting Jacob Tobia for their coming of age gender story memoir, Sissy. So we hope to see you back here in about 25 minutes. Thank you all so much. Thank you for these books. Please use the links in the chat to purchase these books. Edward and Robert are here tonight because they've put so much work into these two books and many other things. So if you can, we hope that you will purchase them and keep supporting that effort. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful night.
Bye all.